Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, wherever you are from around the world. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us for this 30-minute presentation about email and marketing automation technology in 2020. I'm Scott Dill with Real Story Group, and our founder, Tony Byrne, will be on the line momentarily to take us through the heart of today's presentation. But I did want to do a couple things as we get started here. First and foremost, I just wanted to let you know that we will have a couple minutes available at the end for questions. So if you do have questions or any feedback you'd like to share, please enter that into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. I know last week we had some great interaction with our with the folks that were attending, and it'd be great to have that again this week. So please enter those questions in when you have them. Also, I do see a number of subscribers on the line. We certainly appreciate your business, and you are certainly the lifeblood of our organization. So thank you for subscribing, and you will be able to access a copy of the recording of today's presentation in your subscriber library within the next couple of days. And for those who aren't subscribers but have joined us today, welcome, and thank you for participating. You'll be able to get these slides in the next couple of days from our marketing team, and we can certainly talk about subscription options down the road if that's something you'd like to explore further. As we go ahead and get started, I do want to talk a little bit about Real Story Group and the markets we cover within our research. We are at heart an analyst firm that provides detailed research about these different vendors that you see represented on the map. Today, we're going to take a look at the brown line on the subway, so marketing automation and email service providers. You'll see here in the map that there are what you just call hubs in the middle, where you have vendors that have multiple different offerings in the different areas that we cover. But if you look, you'll see there's also a number of vendors on the periphery as well. And those are some of the vendors where you'll end up seeing a lot of the innovation and making some great updates within their products in the marketing automation space. So Tony will certainly dive into that today as part of the presentation. A little bit more background about Real Story Group. As I mentioned, we're at heart, we're an analyst firm, and we've been at this for 19 years now. And where we differ from traditional analyst firms is the fact that we never work for or advise the vendors we cover in any way. So you can be sure that you're going to get the real story about what their products do well, but sometimes more importantly, what they don't do so well and where they might fall short for you. We don't rank the best or worst vendors or believe in any sort of magic within our quadrants. Rather, we talk about what's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through today's presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony and take us through. Tony?
Great, thanks, Scott. Really excited to be here with you all today. It's been quite interesting in the last couple of years, the uptick among our enterprise subscribers in inquiries that we receive around email and outbound messaging more generally, but specifically email. A lot of replacement projects going on right now, which is quite interesting, again, because it's a mature marketplace, but it's a marketplace undergoing some change and a lot of fresh faces and fresh ideas, new architectural structures in particular. And so we thought it was a good time to just kind of check in and say, hey, what's going on here? So it's definitely a changing marketplace. And but the marketplace here I'm talking about is, of course, marketing automation platforms and email service providers. Marketing automation platforms historically with a kind of a B2B emphasis to drive leads towards sales, and then B2C platforms really more around more high volume, consumer oriented B2C type use cases. Sometimes there's some overlap between those two, but historically, and even still today, the market has tended to see these as two different tools. And that's why, for example, you have vendors like Oracle and Adobe and formerly IBM, who literally had separate products for each use case, even though in the end, they're sort of doing similar things. So what's happening in this marketplace? Well, there are new entrants all the time. It's so interesting to us to see this, and part of it is that the cost of entry is fairly low, but also I think there's a lot of price pressures going on here that's really interesting, and also some innovation in the marketplace. So this is basically kind of an outline for the rest of the session here, but the other big trend that we're seeing is new ESP vendors in particular coming to bring kind of clarity on scope, which is that rather than trying to be some kind of omni-channel marketing platform, a real focus among some of the new players just on email. And then what that means is that they're partnering more and following more of a best of breed strategy for things like forms, social messaging, certainly mobile messaging, and even content and asset management, and potentially even authoring happening outside of the system. So that's really interesting. We'll talk about that. The other thing is, I don't know if it's a trend, maybe more of an aspiration, but we think that this is happening, is this kind of fading omni-channel myth. That is that, not that omni-channel is unimportant. In fact, omni-channel strategies and stacks are very important right now. But I think what's fading is this idea that that a single marketing platform can provide this kind of omni-channel engagement in general, and specifically that your outbound messaging platform is going to give you omni-channel capabilities. Now, it may give you multi-channel capabilities, although again, I think this trend we just saw above sort of mitigates against that, but it's certainly not going to give you kind of the omni-channel customer engagement that you might be looking for. And so there's an overall kind of narrowing of scope here. And I think also this expectation among both customers and vendors, I think it's a healthy expectation that as you're going now on what are for most of you really replacement projects, an expectation of deeper vetting this time, that you may have just bought an ESP or a MAP from a vendor who was already an incumbent vendor, or you just got one after a demo. Now this time, as you go to modernize your environment, potentially replace your vendor, you can reasonably have an expectation of doing a deeper vetting of these platforms before you buy it. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so that's the agenda. Let's get into it. These are the vendors that we cover at Real Story Group. Really, it's an overall kind of marketplace that you can divide, again, roughly into two: email service providers with more of a B2C emphasis on top, marketing automation platforms on the bottom. Email service providers, very interesting landscape. You've got a set of some fairly older systems here. If you look at, say, Adobe Campaign, Aprimo, Campaign Monitor, even ExactTarget Marketing Cloud, which is really just Salesforce Marketing Cloud, but we like to remind people many people still know it as ExactTarget. Celadon, also somewhat older, but being kind of refreshed in recent years. IBM, of course, selling off its former Silverpop assets to Acoustic. And so, you know, a lot of those platforms still chugging along. I think a number of customers who are on those platforms are re-examining some of those investments now. And so you're seeing some newer, younger players like MessageGears, Iterable, and Marsys coming into the marketplace with some different architectures. Whether the right vendor for you or not, of course, is an open question, and we'll get into that. But this is, you know, certainly I think back in a few years ago when people predicted this was going to be sort of a 3-horse race, maybe 4-horse race, it's not the case really at all. Marketing automation, of course, has always been very highly fragmented. You've got, you know, some of the traditional heavyweights here, Adobe, now Marketo, Oracle, Eloqua. Microsoft has taken another run at this and has decided to get pretty serious about it, at least for the mid-market, really kind of going head-to-head against Salesforce Pardot there. HubSpot still a big player in the lower middle market, as is Acton, and then CM Group is basically a roll-up of a variety of different, primarily marketing automation platforms that kind of peaked in the marketplace. So, you know, a wide variety of choices there across a whole panoply of sophistication. A lot of interest now in ABM services, and obviously greater degrees of personalization, learning a little bit from the B2C space there. But what's interesting about both of these landscapes is that, you know, these are what we believe to be the major players, but it's important to note that this is not an exhaustive list at all, that there's a whole set of vendors, you know, underneath and arguably to the right or left of these that are putting a lot of pressure on these vendors. And so you have, you know, literally dozens and dozens of choices. And so the landscape is highly fragmented, and in fact, you know, depending on your size, you may want to take, as you go potentially to replace your platform, you may want to take kind of a wide view of the market because you may have more choices than you think. And particularly on the marketing automation side, and to some extent on the ESP side, there are a number of vendors competing primarily on price for customers who are not looking necessarily for advanced functionality and just want the basics. So a lot of opportunities here for you to really kind of rethink your whole orientation. So in terms of that rethinking, I think we're seeing a number of vendors, particularly on the ESP side, taking a more focused scope. So instead of embedding a lot of services into a heavyweight platform, they're really dialed in heavily on email itself, and then partnering for other services so that you can get sort of best of breed services. So for example, SMS. Think about, we're seeing a lot more SMS messages getting kind of embedded into different customer journeys. And in this case, it looks like someone is actually marketing to this person, Ryan. What we see actually more commonly is not so much a marketing offer like this, but a lot of logistical things as well, like it looks like you didn't complete this form. Are you still coming? Would you like a discount more quicker, kind of things that are easier to respond to, that are part and parcel of a larger campaign that may be predominantly email and have other touch points. So SMS, kind of like print, it's just sort of another endpoint in terms of your outbound engagement. And I think what a lot of the newer players in particular have said, look, we're not going to embed, we're not going to create our own services. There's companies like Twilio and at least a dozen other major SMS vendors. We'll just integrate with them or resell them, and it's naturally embedded as just essentially another endpoint, the way that you might also prompt an outbound print message out of a journey like this. So there's really no need to necessarily have to, unless you already don't, if you already don't have an SMS vendor or relationship. My guess is that many of you do, because you're doing SMS across a number of different channels and not just marketing automation or ESP. You don't necessarily have to include that in your solicitation. Then the other issue that's really been a difficult problem for customers over the last 20 years that we've been following content management and email marketing technologies is just this whole issue around forms. Forms are constantly bedeviling and beguiling, and vendors are constantly upgrading their forms and saying, well, now we fixed it, now we've made it a lot more usable. And the reality is that it's hard to do this well. And in the meantime, customers are looking for much more sophisticated forms, more intelligent forms, more conditional logic within forms, that sort of thing. And I think, some of the larger vendors have definitely invested a lot in this. I think there's an open question about whether you should be even handling your intake forms from within your ESP and marketing automation platform, that maybe that's best done elsewhere, either within your content management system or a more dedicated, forms provider. And historically, it wasn't done that way because it was too difficult to wire the data into your marketing automation platform or your ESP. And now it's become a lot easier to be able to do those, and you see these like visual mapping tools and things like that. So I think this is another kind of service that you could, as you reconsider your whole investment here, really reconsider, do I really want forms management from my MAP or ESP? Maybe you do, but maybe you don't have to. Social is another one where, probably 5 years ago or so, we saw these messaging platforms say, look, we can also push to social. Maybe even at the same time you're doing an email campaign, we'll just publish and blast this stuff out to different channels like LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, whatever. And that too, I think, has also faded, both organizationally and just as a stylistically. You don't want to necessarily batch and blast to social. You may want to engage in a much more interactive way. You may want to shape the story around it quite differently. You may want to schedule things differently. You may want to have a series of different sorts of posts with different assets, some of which may be native to that platform. And so even institutionally, particularly in a large organization, your social team, although they should be connected to the broader engagement infrastructure, is usually kind of separate and not necessarily amenable to having other systems doing dispatch and blasting, because they have their own tools like Hootsuite or what have you to manage social engagements. This is another one where, historically this was a kind of a capability that one might look for in an ESP or a MAP, and now is really, I think, for many of you, going to prove superfluous. Now, here's the more interesting one, and again, this has been a constant pain point among ESPs and marketing automation platforms. It's this idea that you should author and manage content within this platform, when the reality is they're typically really frustrating authoring environments and very poor at managing content. And so the question is, particularly as we want to do more component content management and assemble kind of messages dynamically in a more segmented or personalized way, suddenly, the annoyance of content management and authoring within these systems actually becomes a real urgent problem, that they can't really manage components very, very well. So what we're starting to see among some systems is the ability or even the mandate that you author and manage content externally, and the system just simply does the assembly and delivery of that content. And so this is kind of a new model, but certainly one we think that's promising, particularly if you want to do personalization. And it kind of solves two birds with one stone, which is I can now probably author in a better environment and also manage my component pieces, much more effectively than I ever could within the ESP or marketing automation platform itself. So it's interesting, what we've been talking about here are some structural changes in the marketplace and some functional changes that we see emerging here. Not talking a lot necessarily about, say, buzzwords and buzz phrases like AI and ML. Artificial intelligence, certainly very interesting, potentially promising in the way that you can craft and send messages. We've seen it used less on the authoring side and more in terms of building appropriate segments and targeting the right message to the right person. So if you were expecting a big song and dance about how AI is going to change this landscape, you won't hear that so much from us yet. It's basically just another feature, a potentially interesting feature, but I don't think it's going to fundamentally, structurally change the marketplace the way some of these other trends are doing. And then, of course, there's the mega trend that we've been talking about really for the past year, which is the 2020s is going to be the decade of omnichannel, true omnichannel, not multi-channel, where you're pushing and kind of integrating a couple of different channels together, but truly a more customer-centric stack. And what does that mean to have a more customer-centric stack? And if you have a more customer-centric stack, then what does that mean for email and other forms of messaging? So let's talk about that. This is the ideal customer engagement, that if you're going to be customer-centric, then regardless of the engagement channel, you're getting them the right content and message to the right person in the right context at the right time, and you're measuring the effectiveness, right? And so the issue is, of course, that we have been doing a lot of this within individual channels, right? And so each one of these different engagement silos here has its own content, data, rules, planning, and analytics. And of course, email's no different, right? Is that your ESP historically held your content, held your data, in as much as it was often a marketing data warehouse, had the rules and personalizations. You could set up planning and scheduling, and then it had its own analytics, right? The problem is that that's completely disconnected from all of the other systems. So if you're going to be truly customer-centric, what we believe you need to do is think more in terms of enterprise services, where you bring operations, data, orchestration, personalization, content, and intelligence lower within your stack. In other words, for the most part, you're removing those capabilities from individual channel silos and managing them at an enterprise level so you can have a more coherent and integrated customer experience across channels, so that your mobile and social channels know what happened in email and vice versa. And Alexa is telling the same story that your mobile app is telling, and your chatbot has a history of maybe what emails that person has gotten and opened. right? This is obviously not an easy thing to do. Many of you are struggling to get here one way or another. This is kind of an aspirational services architecture, but one we think is essential for the omni-channel world. And so what that means then is a couple of things. One is, if you look at this from a stack perspective, you still have content and engagement management platforms, including email and marketing automation, to manage some of your outbound messaging, right? But they have to obviously live in tandem with service and support, CRM, social, web, and so forth. And they're delivering up through these interaction and delivery environments. But the key thing here is that these enterprise foundation platforms are going to be guiding sort of what's happening in this environment. So a lot of the personalization might come out of your journey orchestration engine, rather than holding all of your marketing and prospect and customer data within the email platform itself. Instead, that should migrate to a customer data platform or some other data mart that has all your definitive, customer data and segments. And then interestingly, and we think this one, may be the slowest to emerge, but still potentially very, very interesting, this notion of an omni-channel content platform. So this is kind of an object store for base components where I'm managing snippets of content that I want to push out through social to my service and support channel. And definitely one of the early use cases we're seeing for this is where I manage content components that are then going to get assembled within an email and marketing automation platform. So here's an example of it. This is from an omni-channel content platform vendor called Core Media. And what's happening here is that I'm actually assembling an email from within the content management system, and then it's connected, in this case, to Salesforce Journey Builder and Salesforce Marketing Cloud. That's actually going to do the assembly and delivery. Now, I could also manage these as components, and based on their metadata, have that then assembled and delivered dynamically depending on the platform that I'm using. That's obviously a more advanced use case that you would need a more higher end platform for, but you get the idea. I'm using an actual authoring and content management environment that's purpose built for that I can also use to then take these assets and artifacts and maybe derive them or copy and use them in other channels as well. So this is an example of kind of decoupling content authoring and content management from the email assembly and delivery, right? And we think that this is the future, much the same way that with a CDP or customer data platform, you're decoupling the data from the delivery environment as well. So take 2 minutes on what we think you should do next, and then I'll remind you that if you have any questions at all, feel free to use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. I see 1 or 2 coming in already, and so we'll definitely have time for more. So the first thing is, if you are looking to replace your ESP or MAP this year, you definitely want to take a more modern, agile, sort of design thinking approach to this. My colleague and I, Jared Gingras, we outlined this in the book, The Right Way to Select Technology, which shows this more agile approach that you were used. You empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test, right? So by empathize, you create actual diverse user stories. So instead of doing a feature checklist of we want this, we don't want that, you actually have user stories, which could be recipients of your messages and also, of course, the people assembling and deliver the messages itself. You created an RFP and a vendor shortlist. Again, we would suggest a longer shortlist. When we've been advising people and when our subscribers are using our tools to actually create those shortlists, we're really encouraging them to cast a wide net. Again, you have proposals and demos in an ideation phase where you're really testing your user stories. Were they really what you wanted? The most important thing here, which we find people really avoiding for some reason in email projects, is this hands-on bake-off. This is really critical. And it does take a little bit of work. You've got to put together some test sets of recipients, some test segments and other sorts of things to play this out. So it takes a little bit more prep than doing a bake-off and some other segments that we cover. But we found it just remarkably useful in terms of being able to test some of the integrations, being able to test the all-important usability and everything else. Then finally, if you're down to a single vendor, you may want to have an optional proof of concept where you're then doing more deeper kind of security, stress testing, and integration testing. So definitely take an iterative sort of test-based approach to this, and don't just buy based off a slick demo or what you saw at a conference. So key takeaways for 2020. Email messaging needs to live within your broader marketing and CX stack and not as an independent freestanding silo. This is maybe the most important point. And so that means that you need to kind of rethink the scope of what you're asking it to do, and you need to make sure that it can integrate with some things that you may have coming online with respect to content, data, and personalization at a more enterprise level going forward. Now, of course, the major suite players are going to claim that their outbound messaging tools are omnichannel, that they can do this kind of omnichannel orchestration for you, and we're here to tell you they are absolutely not. That at best, they are sort of multi-channel from an outbound standpoint, being able to push to messaging and to print. They're not going to help you personalize your web engagement. They're not going to help you understand how you should be interacting with customers through your CRM or service and support platforms. So this is something you need to be very careful about, and definitely not overspend on, for example, an Adobe campaign or an Oracle Eloqua, thinking that they're going to give you an omnichannel solution. In fact, you want to consider some of the newer, more focused market entrants in addition to some of the larger incumbent players. And whatever you do when you're selecting, definitely use an agile test-based approach. We recommend this for any MarTech platform, but that includes email solutions, which sometimes feel somewhat challenging and difficult to test, but actually you can actually test them in a bake-off. So with that, I'll just wrap up here and say, if you are someone who manages your entire MarTech stack, we call it Stacy the Stacker. Our mission in life at Real Story Group is to help you answer all the questions that you have, and to be your guide through this whole journey, and an advocate who's on your side of the table. And the first way we do that is by providing hard-hitting research. In this case, we evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of all the major ESP and MAP vendors. You can go to realstorygroup.com/try to download a free sample to see what our research is all about. And so that's the first of our three offerings, which is vendor selection advisory. We give you hard-hitting research, allow you to build a real quadrant rather than a magic quadrant, using your own requirements to come up with a short list. And then we empower your team with critical research and candid advice. Some stack owners opt to get strategic decisions and technology choices through an omni-channel stack advisory service, where they get access to all of our research and we advise them on their stack as a whole. And then a subset of those people then join our exclusive peer-reviewed, peer-oriented omni-channel stack council. These are stack owners and leaders who get together 3 times a year. We're getting together next week in Atlanta. Really excited about that. 24 stack leaders to share lessons and sometimes mistakes with each other over a couple days. So if that's of interest, please do follow up with us. So Scott, I'll let you cover up on any next steps, and then we've got a couple questions coming in.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as we mentioned at the top, these slides will be available to you in the next couple of days. So keep an eye out on that as they'll be coming from our marketing team. Also, as Tony mentioned, we do have interactive tools that you can try out on your own on our website, but I can also actually take you on a more in-depth behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience. So if that's something you'd like to schedule, just reach out to us at explore at realstorygroup.com. And in terms of webinars, we'll be taking next week off for the Tech Stack Council meeting that Tony mentioned, but in 2 weeks, please join us for the right way to select technology for your new omni-channel stack. It does look like a couple questions have come in. We got a couple extra minutes of overtime here. So Tony, why don't you take those away?
Yeah, so Jonathan is asking where's Infusionsoft and all this, and Infusionsoft is, a long-time marketing automation platform vendor. We used to cover them. We just dropped them this year, basically due to a lack of any kind of inquiries or interest among our subscriber base, but we do have kind of a legacy evaluation. So Jonathan, if you're a subscriber, we can definitely share that with you. Miles is asking, are there any word on whether Sprinklr will emerge as an official ESP? That's a great question, and my guess is probably yes, but it's really interesting what this means, official ESP, because we see a lot of email and messaging subsystems within other products, including Sprinklr, which is nominally a social management and messaging platform, but of course it's kind of expanded to be more than that, kind of the same way that HubSpot expanded out from just being CRM to a number of different things. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Sprinklr made a major play out of this as opposed to being just a minor play. But we do see this particularly more in the lower mid-market, but we see different tools like particularly in higher ed or manufacturing, where they bolt on an email marketing platform or subsystem within the broader platform. What we're seeing though, Miles, is companies tending to stay away from those and instead wiring in their main email messaging platform into their other systems, so that even for like transactional messages, they're being routed through their email service provider rather than having email come from a variety of different platforms where you can't always control the templates, the behaviors, and certainly the analytics around it. Not to mention some of the issues around preferences and GDPR and everything else. So, if Sprinklr could emerge as an official ESP, my guess is it's always going to play second fiddle to their social capabilities. Ben is doing us a favor here and suggesting there may be an issue with realstorygroup.com/try. It may be referring to realstorygroup.com/reports. You can click there to get a sample, or you can go just to realstorygroup.com/sample. Just a couple of weeks ago, we upgraded our website. We still have a few lingering redirects that we're working on. So Ben, thank you for pointing that out to us. Okay, so we're a little bit after the half hour. I wanted to thank you all again for attending and reminding you we've got another webinar in a couple of weeks. But really good to see you on board. Look for a message with a copy of this deck in the next 48 hours or so. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne and the rest of the Real Story Group team wishing you a great rest of your week, and catch you next time. Bye now.